My wife boasted she destroyed my parents' house, and I remember the exact moment her voice crossed the line from anger into something colder, something almost satisfied. I destroyed your parents' house, Victoria said through the phone, like she was announcing a purchase she was proud of. I did not answer her right away, and that silence made her laugh softly, like she expected me to break. Before that call, I had already lived through years of being told I did not understand money, did not understand family, and did not understand my own marriage. You always protect things that don't matter. She used to say at the kitchen table in Richmond, Virginia, her fingers tapping near the papers she wanted me to sign. You act like that old house is sacred, she said once, looking at me like I was slow to learn. My parents' house in Charlottesville had stood longer than most of our arguments, but in her mind it was just numbers on a page, just value to be unlocked. That night when she called again, her voice carried something sharper, almost celebratory. It's done, William, she said. I had it taken care of. And still, I did not react the way she expected. I remember standing by the kitchen window, watching the Virginia rain slide down the glass like it had nowhere else to go, and I said only, "You're certain about that? My name is William Carter. I am 67 years old, and if this story reaches you in the way I think it might, I would only ask that you consider staying until the end, and if it speaks to your heart in any way, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is where you are right now, because stories like this always feel different depending on the hour you hear them. And now I want you to stay with me as I take you back to where everything actually began, because what my wife thought she destroyed was never what she understood in the first place, and the lesson hidden in all of this will not make sense until the very end. I was born in Richmond, Virginia, and for most of my life I worked in financial compliance and estate consulting, the kind of work where people trust you with their history but never really know you personally. And maybe that was the first mistake in my marriage, because Victoria never liked what she could not fully see or control. When she called me that night, her tone was calm in a way that did not match the words she was using, and she said again, almost slowly, "I destroyed it, William. Your parents' house is gone." And I remember closing my eyes for a moment because what she did not understand was not the emotion of it, but the structure behind it, the legal structure that my father had insisted on building years before he passed. A structure I had only helped maintain, never fully owned. Why would you do that? I finally asked, not loudly, not in anger, just in a way that felt like I was measuring distance rather than conflict. And she responded instantly, "Because you refuse to give me access to what is mine." And I remember hearing movement in the background of her call, papers, maybe footsteps, the sound of a life that believed it had already won. Earlier that same week we had argued in our kitchen about the inheritance, $5 million she kept referring to as if it was sitting in a single account waiting for her approval. "We are married," she said, leaning forward, her voice tight. "There is no such thing as yours and mine anymore." And I had told her something she never forgave me for. In this case, there is. And that was the moment something in her shifted. What she did not know, what she never bothered to understand, was that my parents' house in Charlottesville was not just property. It was part of a layered trust arrangement created decades earlier, tied to conditions she never saw, reviewed annually by an attorney she never met, and governed by clauses that only activated under specific legal circumstances. I had learned a long time ago that money does not destroy families, assumptions do, and Victoria had built her entire certainty on assumptions. When she called again later that night to repeat herself, her voice almost proud, she said, "You should see it now. It's finished." And I remember answering her with something she did not expect, something calm enough to make her pause. I said, "Then you should probably check the deed again." And that was the first moment I heard silence from her end that felt unfamiliar. I did not tell her then what I already suspected, that destroying the physical structure of something does not always destroy its legal existence, and that in Virginia estate law, intention and authorization matter far more than impulse. I could hear her breathing change slightly, the confidence thinning just enough to notice, and she said, "What are you talking about?" But I did not answer immediately, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a conversation like that is give clarity too early. Instead, I placed the phone down for a second, looked out at the dark line of trees beyond my backyard, and thought about my father's voice years ago telling me, "Never assume a system is as simple as it looks." And in that moment, I realized Victoria had not destroyed anything she understood. She had only disturbed something she could not see. When I picked the phone back up, I heard her say my name again, but this time it was different, less certain, and that was when I knew something had already begun moving without her permission. Something in the legal system she never bothered to respect. And the last thing she said before the line went quiet was, "William, what did you do?" And that was when I understood the real question was not what I had done, but what she had just triggered without realizing it had been there all along. I did not sleep after that call, not really. I sat in the same chair by the kitchen window, watching the dark Virginia tree line hold still like it was listening to me breathe. Victoria did not call back immediately. That silence should have felt like relief, but it did not. It felt like the moment before a storm reaches the edge of your house. When the air itself changes pressure, and you know something is already decided without your permission. I kept thinking about her voice, not the anger, not even the pride, but the certainty. People do not speak that way unless they believe the outcome is already behind them. And that was what worried me more than anything. Because certainty in someone who does not understand what they are touching is usually the beginning of damage they cannot undo. My phone lit up once at 2:13 inches the morning. Not her. A message from an old number I had not seen in years. "You need to call me. This is about your father's trust file." The name attached was Robert Ellison, the estate attorney who had handled my parents' legal structure for over 2 decades. I stared at that message longer than I should have, because names like his do not appear in your life unless something already started moving without you. And in that moment, everything pulled me backward, not just in memory, but in weight. I was not always the man sitting in a quiet house in Richmond, listening to silence. I used to be the man who sat in rooms where decisions about other people's entire futures were made with a single signature. And long before Victoria ever believed she understood my world, there was another world that shaped mine entirely. I was 34 when my father first took me into that small office in Charlottesville, the one with the oak desk that always smelled faintly of old paper and ink. He did not speak much that day. He just placed a folder in front of me and said, "This house is not just ours anymore. It is protection for this family." My mother sat beside him, quiet in the way she always was when decisions were being made that she trusted more than she understood. "What kind of protection?" I asked. My father looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Protection from people who think they understand what we built." I did not fully understand it then. Most sons do not. They hear the word trust and think it means something simple, something emotional. It is not. It is structure, timing, legal memory. It remembers things people forget. Years later, when I met Victoria, she used to laugh when I told her I worked in compliance and estate advisory. "So you manage paperwork for rich people," she said once at dinner in Alexandria, Virginia, swirling her glass like she had already decided what my life meant. "It is more complicated than that," I told her. She smiled without looking at me. Everything is complicated when men want it to sound important. That was the first time I noticed something about her that I did not yet have a name for. It was not cruelty, it was evaluation. Like she was always deciding what parts of the world deserved respect. Over the years, that evaluation expanded. It moved from my work to my habits, from my habits to my decisions, and eventually to my family. I remember one Thanksgiving in Richmond when my parents still hosted dinners at the house in Charlottesville. Victoria stood in the kitchen afterward, watching my mother wash dishes, and she said quietly, "They live like this their whole lives?" My mother turned slightly. "Like what?" Victoria smiled politely. "Careful." I remember the way my mother paused for just a second too long before answering. "Careful keeps things standing," she said. Victoria never liked that answer. After that night, her comments became smaller but sharper. Not enough for others to notice. Enough for me to feel them later when the room was quiet. "Your parents are very attached to that house," she said another time, while we were driving back from Charlottesville. "It is not attachment," I said. "It is history." She laughed once, softly. Everything is history until someone sells it. That was the pattern I did not fully recognize until much later. It was never one attack. It was accumulation. Small dismissals layered over years until they began to feel normal. And the most dangerous part of accumulation is that it teaches you not to react. You begin to conserve your voice because you believe speaking will not change anything. That is what I did. I learned to stay quiet at the wrong times. Not because I agreed, but because I believed silence would preserve stability. When my father passed, The house in Charlottesville did not change hands in the way Victoria assumed things changed hands. There were documents, layers, conditions that existed long before she ever entered my life. My father used to say, "A house is never just wood and land. It is a decision that continues after you are gone." I did not realize how literal he meant that until the attorney called me again later that morning. "William," Robert Ellison said, his voice heavier than I remembered, "we have a problem. Your wife has initiated action against the property boundary of the trust asset." I closed my eyes briefly. "Explain it in plain terms," I said. There was a pause. "She believes she removed value from the property. But legally, she may have triggered a review condition that affects the entire estate structure." I did not respond immediately, because in that moment, I was not thinking about law. I was thinking about Victoria's certainty again, the kind that does not ask questions before acting. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "Did she understand what she was touching?" I asked. The attorney answered carefully, "No, William, I do not think she did." And that was when I realized this was no longer about anger or marriage or even money. It was about a system she believed she could interrupt without consequence, and a history she never took the time to understand. Outside my window, the sky was beginning to lighten in the slow, reluctant way mornings arrive in Virginia, and I sat there thinking not about what she had done, but about what had already been set in motion long before she decided to act. I remember the moment everything started to shift, not because of one single event, but because of the way Victoria entered the room that morning as if she already owned the outcome of my life. It was in our house in Richmond, Virginia, the one with the quiet street where neighbors waved but never really stopped to talk. The air inside felt heavier than usual, like the house itself was listening. Victoria placed her phone face down on the kitchen counter and looked at me without hesitation. "We need to talk about your inheritance," she said, not asking, but declaring. I was still pouring coffee. I did not look up immediately. "There is nothing to talk about," I answered calmly. That was the truth. But she did not like truth when it did not bend in her direction. She stepped closer, her voice tightening. $5 million is sitting in structures you refuse to explain. That is not normal in a marriage, William. I set the cup down slowly. It is not your inheritance to control. That sentence changed the temperature in the room. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to make silence feel uncomfortable. She laughed once, but it was not humor. It was disbelief. "You are unbelievable," she said. "After everything I have put up with, you still talk like this is only yours." I looked at her then, really looked, and I saw something I had been avoiding for years. Not anger, not confusion, but entitlement that had learned to disguise itself as fairness. Later that afternoon, she made the first direct move. It was not dramatic. It was administrative. She called our financial advisor without telling me, then left the phone on speaker when I walked into the room. "We are consolidating accounts," she said smoothly. "My husband agrees." I turned to her immediately. I did not agree to that. The advisor went quiet on the line. Victoria did not even flinch. "You will," she said softly, covering the phone with her hand for a moment. "You always do when things make sense." That was the first time I understood she was not trying to argue with me. She was trying to replace my decisions with her certainty. Over the following days, the pattern escalated. Documents appeared on the kitchen table that I had not seen before. A restructuring proposal for assets tied to my parents' estate. A suggestion that the Charlottesville property should be liquidated for efficiency. That was the word she used, efficiency, as if history could be optimized like a spreadsheet. One evening, I found her in the living room with my father's old file box open on the coffee table. I had not even realized she knew where it was. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly. She did not look guilty. She looked focused. "Understanding what you keep hidden from me," she said. I stepped closer. "That is not yours to go through." She finally looked up at me, her tone sharper now. "Everything in this house is part of my life, William. That includes what your parents left behind." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "You are not understanding what that box represents." She closed it firmly. "I understand it perfectly. It represents control you refuse to share." Then came the shift I will never forget. It was not planned. It was emotional impatience, the kind that creates irreversible consequences. A week later, she returned from a meeting with her attorney already convinced of victory. She walked through the door, and did not even remove her coat. I handled it, she said immediately. The property situation. I looked at her slowly. What does that mean exactly? She smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. It means I removed leverage. Your parents' house is no longer a factor in your little trust games. I remember the way my hand stopped halfway to the table. Not fear, not shock, calculation. You need to explain that, I said. She placed her purse down carefully, almost satisfied. It is gone, she said simply. Consider it resolved. That was the moment I realized she had crossed into something she did not understand. Because she was not talking about ownership. She was talking about assumption. And assumption, in estate law, is where people destroy themselves without realizing it. Victoria, I said slowly, who advised you on that? She tilted her head slightly. My attorney. Why? I nodded once, more to myself than to her. You should not have done that without reviewing the trust language. She sighed, irritated now. Stop acting like everything is some complicated system only you can understand. I did not respond immediately, because I was thinking about a clause my father had insisted on years ago, something I had once thought was excessive caution. A protection mechanism written specifically for moments like this, when someone acted without authority but believed they had it. Victoria misread my silence as defeat. It is done, she repeated, softer now, almost satisfied. There is nothing you can do about it. I finally looked at her again, and I said something she did not understand in the moment. Then you just changed more than you think. Her phone buzzed on the counter at that exact moment, and she glanced at it casually, unaware that the name on the screen would later be the first signal that something far larger had already been set into motion, long before she ever touched that house. The morning after Victoria said those words, the house in Richmond felt different, not louder, not quieter, just structurally unstable in a way I could not explain to anyone who had never worked with legal systems long enough to hear silence as a warning sign. I sat at the edge of the kitchen table with a legal folder in front of me that I had not opened yet, my coffee already cold, my phone placed face down like it might interrupt something I was not ready to name. Victoria was still upstairs, moving around as if nothing had changed. That was her strength, the ability to rewrite tension into normality. At 9:17 a.m., the doorbell rang. Not once, twice. Sharp, intentional. I did not move immediately. Then it rang a third time, and Victoria called from upstairs. Can you get that? I am busy. I opened the door expecting a delivery, but instead I saw a man I had not seen in over a decade. He was older now. Hair thinner, posture still precise, wearing a dark gray suit that looked like it belonged more in a courtroom than a neighborhood in Virginia. He looked at me for exactly 2 seconds before saying my name, William Carter. I did not answer right away. Not because I did not recognize him, but because recognition carried weight I was not ready to lift. Robert Ellison, I finally said. His expression did not soften. It tightened. We need to talk. Now. Behind me, I heard Victoria's footsteps pause at the top of the stairs. Who is it? She asked. I did not turn around when I answered. Someone you should have met before you made decisions about my family's estate. Robert stepped inside without waiting for permission, which already told me everything about the urgency of what he had come to say. He placed a thin leather folder on the kitchen table and looked around the room once, like he was measuring consequences that had not yet fully arrived. I got your message, I said. He nodded once. Then you already know something has been triggered. Victoria walked into the kitchen at that moment, still holding her phone. Triggered? She repeated. What does that even mean? Robert looked at her directly for the first time. It means, he said calmly, that someone has acted on property tied to a protected estate structure without understanding the legal boundaries involved. Victoria laughed lightly. Protected estate structure? It is a house, not a national security file. Robert did not react to the sarcasm. That was what made him dangerous in rooms like this. He simply opened the folder and slid a single page forward. Mrs. Carter, he said, this property is not standalone. It is part of a trust chain established in 1998. It includes conditional clauses that activate under unauthorized alteration or destruction of physical assets. Victoria stopped smiling, just slightly. You are telling me a house has clauses? She asked. I am telling you, Robert replied, that you interacted with an asset you did not have authority to modify. I finally sat down, not because I was weak, but because standing felt unnecessary at that point. Victoria turned to me. You knew about this? She asked sharply. I met her eyes. Yes. Her voice rose slightly. And you did not tell me? I shook my head once. You never asked what you were actually touching. That sentence landed heavier than I expected. She turned back to Robert immediately. So fix it, she said. Reverse whatever this is. Robert exhaled slowly, almost like he had heard that request many times before from people who believed systems worked like personal favors. It does not work that way, he said. Once the trigger condition is met, the estate enters mandatory review by probate court. Nothing moves privately anymore. Victoria stepped closer to the table. That is ridiculous. Robert looked at her without emotion. It is law. There was a pause then, a long one, where the house itself seemed louder than anyone speaking inside it. Victoria finally turned back to me, and for the first time I saw something under her confidence that I had not seen before. Uncertainty. Tell him to stop this, she said quietly. I did not answer immediately, because in that moment I realized she still believed this was something I controlled emotionally, rather than something already locked into process. William, Robert said, his voice lower now. There is something else you need to understand. I looked at him. Go on. He hesitated for the first time. There is an external party who has already filed preliminary notice regarding the trust activation. They were notified within hours of the incident. Victoria frowned. What external party? Robert looked at me before answering. Your father's former military legal liaison. He was named as secondary oversight executor. The room went still, not silent. Still, because that name carried a history Victoria had never been part of. I felt something in my chest tighten, not fear, but recognition of timing. The kind you only feel when you realize events are no longer reacting to you, but unfolding independently. Victoria noticed my expression change. What is that supposed to mean? She asked. Robert closed the folder slowly. It means, he said, that someone who understands exactly how this structure works has just been informed that it has been compromised. And before Victoria could respond, my phone vibrated on the table. One message, unknown number. I looked down at it, and for the first time that morning, I felt something shift that had nothing to do with marriage, or trust, or money. It was simply this. The system I thought I understood was no longer waiting for permission to respond. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like my house and started feeling like a place where decisions were being made about me without my consent. Robert Ellison was still standing near the kitchen table, the folder closed now, his hand resting on it like he was guarding something that had already been released. Victoria was pacing slowly behind the counter, her phone still in her hand, but she was no longer checking it. She was waiting, and I could feel it, the shift in her confidence, the way uncertainty had started to creep into the edges of her posture. Then Robert spoke again, quietly, as if choosing each word with precision. William, he said, there is something Victoria does not understand yet, and you need to decide how much of it she learns today. Victoria stopped pacing immediately. Excuse me? She said. Robert did not look at her. He looked at me. Your parents' estate was never just a property transfer, he continued. It was part of a multi-layer protection structure designed over decades. Your father insisted on contingencies that extend beyond standard probate limitations. Victoria let out a short laugh, but it sounded thinner this time. This is ridiculous, she said. It is a house in Charlottesville. Robert finally turned toward her fully. It was never just a house, he replied. Then he looked back at me. William, you should tell her the rest. I did not answer immediately, because the rest was not something I had ever spoken out loud in full, not even to myself in one sitting. It was something you carry in pieces, like weight distributed across years so it does not break you in one moment. Victoria crossed her arms tightly. Tell me what? She demanded. I exhaled slowly and finally spoke. My father did not trust simple ownership, I said. He believed people change when they think they control something too quickly. Victoria narrowed her eyes. That is not an explanation. I nodded once. No, it is not the full one. Robert stepped slightly forward. The house was placed under a conditional estate framework tied to secondary verification clauses, he said, meaning any unauthorized structural interference triggers automatic legal review across the entire trust portfolio. Victoria stared at him. Portfolio? She repeated. That was the first crack. Not anger. Not denial. just confusion breaking through certainty. I looked at her then, not with triumph, not with judgment, but with something closer to exhaustion. There were more assets than you were aware of, I said quietly, because you never asked how far it went. She turned toward me immediately. So you were saying I do not know my own marriage? There was pain in her voice now, but it was wrapped in anger, which made it harder to reach. I am saying, I replied, you made assumptions about a system you never tried to understand. Robert opened the folder again and placed a second document on the table. There is also something else, he said. Victoria leaned forward slightly. What now? Robert hesitated just long enough for the room to feel tighter. The estate includes a protective oversight clause involving external legal review by a military-affiliated trustee. Victoria blinked. Military? She said, almost scoffing. I felt my throat tighten slightly, because I already knew where this was going before he finished. Robert nodded once. Yes. Your father's designated secondary trustee was a former legal officer connected to military estate compliance divisions. He was activated upon breach notification. Victoria turned back to me instantly. You are joking, she said. I did not respond, because I was no longer surprised. I was simply remembering, years ago, sitting in my father's study, hearing him say, "Do not ever assume this family will be unprotected if I am not here to speak for it." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I understood he was being precise. Robert continued. We received confirmation that he has reviewed the initial trigger report. Victoria's voice rose slightly. And what does that mean exactly? Robert answered calmly. It means someone with authority to interpret the structure has already classified this as a high-priority estate breach review. Victoria looked between both of us, and for the first time, her confidence did not find a place to land. No, she said quietly. No, this is just paperwork. You are making this sound bigger than it is. I shook my head slightly. You still think this is about paperwork? I said. It is not. She stepped closer to me now, her voice lower but sharper. Then what is it about? I paused, because this was the part that mattered. Not the legal structure, not the assets. The realization. It is about authority, I said. And what happens when someone acts as if they have it without ever being granted it? The room went still again. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. Normal life continuing as if nothing inside this house was shifting into something irreversible. Victoria looked down at the table, then back at Robert. So what happens now? She asked. Robert closed the folder once more. Now, he said, the system verifies intent, authority, and consequence. And that process cannot be reversed by either of you. I watched Victoria in that moment, not as an opponent, not as a wife, but as someone realizing that the version of control she believed she had was never fully real. And then my phone lit up again. Unknown number. One line of text only. We have confirmed activation. Do not engage further without counsel. And for the first time since this began, I understood something very clearly. This was no longer about what Victoria thought she had done. It was about what had already been recorded long before she ever decided to act. The message on my phone did not disappear after I read it. It stayed there, glowing faintly on the kitchen table like a mark that could not be erased. We have confirmed activation. Do not engage further without counsel. Victoria saw it before I even turned the screen away. Her eyes narrowed immediately. What is that? She asked, her voice already shifting into something defensive. Robert Ellison closed the folder slowly, almost deliberately, like a man who had seen this exact moment unfold in different homes for years. It means, he said calmly, that the estate review process has officially moved beyond private negotiation. Victoria let out a short laugh, but it cracked halfway through. Estate review? You are making this sound like a criminal case. She turned toward me suddenly. William, tell me what you did. That was the first time her voice lost its balance. Not fully, just enough to notice. I looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to clarity. I did not do anything, I said. This started the moment you acted on something you did not understand. Her face tightened. That is not true, she said quickly. You were trying to make this about me. Robert raised one hand slightly. Mrs. Carter, he said, no one is accusing you of intent beyond the facts. But the system does not evaluate intent first. It evaluates authority. Victoria turned sharply toward him. I had authority, she said. I had legal advice. Robert nodded once, slow. Advice is not authorization. That sentence landed heavily in the room. Victoria stepped back slightly, like she was recalculating the entire conversation. This is ridiculous, she said again, but quieter now. We are talking about a house, a property transfer. That is all. I finally spoke again, my voice steady. It was never only a house, I said. You just never asked what it was attached to. She pointed at me immediately. You keep saying that. Attached to what? I paused for a moment, because this was the shift. This was where truth stopped being abstract. It is attached to my father's estate structure, I said, which was built to prevent exactly this kind of interference. Victoria shook her head rapidly. No, that is not possible. You are exaggerating this because you are trying to scare me. I did not move. I am not trying to scare you, I said quietly. I am telling you what already happened. Robert opened his phone now, scanning something, then turned it slightly so I could see the screen. The notification came from the Military Estate Oversight Trustee, he said. They have already logged the breach event and issued preliminary restrictions on associated accounts. Victoria's breathing changed. I could hear it now, shorter, less controlled. Restrictions? She repeated. What restrictions? Robert answered without hesitation. Financial containment pending court review. She looked at him like the words were refusing to make sense. You cannot freeze my accounts over a house, she said. Robert did not react. You did not trigger it over a house, he replied. That was the first time she turned fully toward me without speaking. There was no confidence left in her expression now, only urgency trying to rebuild itself. William, she said again, slower this time, fix this. I shook my head once. I cannot fix what I did not create. Her voice rose slightly. You are my husband, she said. You have to do something. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I am telling the truth, I said. That is what I am doing. Silence filled the space again, but it was different now, not heavy, not suspended. It was breaking. Victoria turned away sharply, pacing once across the kitchen. This is a mistake, she said to herself more than to anyone else. This is some misunderstanding. She stopped suddenly and turned back to Robert. Who exactly made this decision? Robert folded his hands in front of him. The oversight trustee and the estate compliance office, he said. Both confirmed the activation threshold was met. Victoria laughed again, but it was unstable now. Threshold, she repeated. You people talk like this is some military operation. I heard the word land differently than she intended. Because in a way, it was. Not in force, not in violence, but in structure, precision, consequence. Victoria walked closer to me now, her voice lower, sharper again. You set me up, she said. I met her eyes. No, I said. You acted without understanding the framework you were operating inside. That made her stop, just for a second. Robert stepped forward slightly, his tone firm now. Mrs. Carter, I strongly recommend you stop all direct actions and allow counsel to handle communication from this point forward. Victoria looked at him, then back at me, and for the first time I saw something close to fear. Not of losing, of not knowing the rules of the game she had already played. This is not over, she said finally, but it did not sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like uncertainty trying to disguise itself. I nodded slightly. No, I said. It is not over. And that was the truth I could finally say without emotion. Because somewhere outside this house, processes had already begun that none of us in this room could stop, pause, or reverse. And for the first time since Victoria made that call, I understood clearly that what she thought was destruction was only the first visible sign of something much larger already in motion. I remember the first sign that everything was no longer under anyone's control inside that house. And it was not a loud moment. It was a fracture in tone. Victoria was standing near the kitchen counter, her arms crossed tightly, when her phone rang again. This time she answered immediately, almost aggressively, like she was trying to regain authority through volume alone. Yes, I already told you what happened, she said into the phone. Then she paused. I watched her expression change, not suddenly, but in layers. Confusion first, then irritation, then something closer to disbelief. What do you mean it is not processed yet? She said sharply. I could hear a man's voice faintly through the speaker, but not clearly enough to identify. Robert Ellison stood near the table, watching her without moving. I did not speak. I did not interrupt, because I already recognized the pattern. When systems begin to activate, people always assume they can negotiate with them. Victoria lowered the phone slightly. They are saying it is on hold, she muttered, looking at me immediately. This is your fault somehow, is it not? I shook my head once. No, I said. This is not about fault anymore. That was when her frustration shifted into something more unstable. You keep saying that, she snapped. You keep talking like this is bigger than it is. Robert stepped forward slightly. It is already bigger than any one person in this room, he said calmly. Victoria turned on him. Then fix it, she said. You are the lawyer. Fix it. Robert did not react emotionally. That was what made him dangerous in situations like this. He simply said, it cannot be reversed unilaterally once triggered by compliance review. Victoria stared at him for a moment, then suddenly laughed again, but this time it was short, sharp, and hollow. Compliance review, she repeated. You people love your words. She turned away from us and walked toward the window, then back again, faster now. This is ridiculous, she said again, but her voice was losing structure. I did what any reasonable person would do. That house was being withheld from me. From us. She pointed at me now. You were hiding everything. I finally spoke, slowly. I was not hiding anything. I was following legal structure that existed long before you decided it was negotiable. That sentence made her stop pacing for a second. Not because she agreed, but because it removed emotion from the conversation entirely. Robert opened his phone and showed me a message. I read it without touching it. External trustee response confirmed. Internal parties disputing authorization. Victoria leaned forward. What does that mean? She asked immediately. Robert answered, it means there are now two interpretations of what was done, and they are already being reviewed independently. She turned to me sharply. Two interpretations? That is not how law works. I looked at her. It is exactly how it works when multiple estate authorities are involved, I said. Which you never asked about. That was when the first crack inside her confidence turned into something visible. She looked down at her phone again, scrolling rapidly now. I called them, she said under her breath. I already called them. She pressed the screen harder. Why are they not responding? Robert answered quietly. Because communication has been redirected through counsel-only channels. Victoria stopped moving completely. The silence that followed was different from earlier silences. Earlier silence had been tension. This silence was separation. Then her phone rang again. She answered immediately. Yes, she said quickly. Then she froze. I could hear the voice more clearly this time. A different man, sharper tone. Victoria's posture changed instantly. What do you mean restricted? She said. You cannot restrict access like that without notice. There was a pause. Her hand tightened around the phone. No, you listen to me, she said, her voice rising now. I am the spouse. I have rights to those accounts. Another pause. Her eyes flicked toward me again, but this time there was no accusation, only panic forming beneath it. This is a mistake, she said into the phone. You are confusing something. Then she pulled the phone away and stared at it like it had betrayed her. They froze it, she said quietly. Robert nodded once. That is standard protocol during estate breach review. Victoria turned suddenly toward him. You knew this would happen, she said. Robert did not answer, because answering was not his role anymore. She turned back to me, her voice lower now, almost shaking. William, she said, tell them to stop this. I looked at her for a long moment. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just clarity. I cannot stop a process I did not initiate, I said. That was when she broke from argument into something else. Not surrender. Not yet. But fragmentation. This is insane, she said, walking back toward the counter. It is a house. It is a family matter. This is not supposed to turn into whatever this is. Robert spoke again, calmly. It became formal the moment you acted without verified authority. Victoria suddenly slammed her hand lightly on the counter, not violently, but enough to release pressure. Then who gave them authority? She demanded. Robert looked at me briefly before answering. The structure itself, he said, and the original estate conditions. Victoria turned slowly back to me. So you are telling me, she said, that I never had control at all. I did not answer immediately. because the truth was more precise than she was ready to hear. Finally, I said, I am telling you that control was never what you thought it was. The phone in her hand vibrated again, and this time she did not answer immediately. She just stared at it. And in that moment, I realized something that changed the shape of everything that followed. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue, because the system she thought she was fighting was already moving forward without asking either of us for permission. I remember the exact moment the energy in the room stopped feeling like conflict and started feeling like collapse, not dramatic collapse, not cinematic collapse, but the quiet kind where people realize they are no longer standing on the version of reality they believed they owned. Victoria was still holding her phone, but she was no longer speaking into it. She was listening, and whatever she was hearing on the other end was stripping away whatever certainty she had left. No, that cannot be right, she said finally, her voice smaller now, almost careful. You must be mistaken. There was a pause. I could not hear the voice on the other side anymore, but I did not need to. I had seen this pattern before in boardrooms and legal reviews. When people realize the structure they challenge does not bend toward emotion, it only bends toward documentation. Victoria lowered the phone slowly. They are saying, she began, then stopped, then started again. They are saying everything tied to that estate is now under formal restriction pending full review. Robert Ellison did not move. He simply nodded once, like a man confirming something already written in advance. That is correct, he said. Victoria turned toward him sharply. This is not normal, she said. You cannot just freeze everything because of a misunderstanding. Robert's voice stayed steady. It is not a misunderstanding anymore. It is a legal classification. I watched her face carefully, not because I wanted to win anything, but because I could see the exact point where denial stops being useful. She took a step backward, then another, like the kitchen itself had become unfamiliar territory. No, she said again, but this time it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. This is just temporary. William, tell them this is unnecessary. She turned to me, and I saw something I had not seen in her before. Not anger, not control, but dependence on my agreement, as if my agreement could override systems already in motion. I shook my head once. It does not work like that, I said quietly. That sentence landed harder than anything else I had said so far, because it removed me from the role she wanted me to play. Robert finally opened his phone again and read silently for a moment. There is confirmation, he said. The external trustee has escalated this to full estate review protocol. All associated accounts are now under temporary administrative control. Victoria stepped forward immediately. Administrative control by who? She asked. Robert answered without hesitation. By the oversight authority named in your father-in-law's estate directive. That was when I saw her first real fracture. Her voice rose slightly. This is absurd. I did not do anything illegal. Robert looked at her calmly. No one has used that word, he said. But legality is not the only trigger condition in estate structures like this. Victoria turned back to me again, and now her voice carried something closer to desperation. You need to fix this, she said. You need to call someone. You need to stop this before it goes further. I looked at her for a long moment, not as a partner, not as an opponent, just as someone finally seeing the full shape of what had been building underneath years of assumptions. I am not in control of it, I said, and neither are you. That was when the silence changed again. It was no longer tension. It was separation. The system had moved beyond conversation. Robert closed the folder gently and spoke with final clarity. At this stage, he said, the only actions available are compliance and review. No private resolution is possible. Victoria looked around the room like she was searching for something solid to hold on to. There has to be a way out of this, she said. But it sounded less like a demand and more like fear speaking through habit. I did not respond immediately, because in my mind, I was no longer in the kitchen. I was somewhere quieter, somewhere older. I was thinking about my parents sitting at that long wooden table in Charlottesville, talking about continuity, about protection, about how certain decisions are designed not for the present moment but for moments like this one. Victoria suddenly sat down at the edge of a chair without realizing it, as if her body had decided before her mind did that standing was no longer necessary. I just wanted control over what was fair, she said softly, almost to herself. Robert responded gently, almost clinically. Fairness is not the mechanism here. Structure is. That was when I stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, Richmond looked unchanged. Cars passing, trees still moving slightly in the wind, life continuing as if nothing inside this house had shifted permanently. But I knew it had. Victoria spoke again behind me, her voice now quieter. "What happens to us now?" she asked. I did not turn around immediately, because the answer was not about punishment. It was about distance. "Now," I said finally, "everything that was assumed gets replaced with what is documented." I turned back toward her then. She was no longer arguing, no longer resisting, just sitting in the reality she had not prepared for. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something I did not expect. Not victory, not anger, just stillness. The kind that comes when you realize you are no longer inside the conflict. You are outside it. The house in Richmond felt different the next morning, not because anything had changed physically, but because everything had changed legally, emotionally, and quietly in ways that no one inside it could undo anymore. Victoria was no longer speaking in commands. She was speaking in fragments, short sentences, pauses. Silence between thoughts that used to be certainty. I stood by the kitchen window holding a simple cup of coffee, watching the same street I had watched for years, but it no longer felt like a place where conflict lived. It felt like a place where consequences had finally arrived without needing permission. Robert Ellison had left just after sunrise. Before he went, he said only one sentence: "It is no longer about action. It is about outcome now." And then he was gone. Victoria was sitting at the dining table when I turned around. No phone in her hand this time. No documents. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after noise stops pretending it has control. "So what now?" she asked quietly, not looking at me. I took a moment before answering, because the truth was no longer complicated. It had simplified itself. "Now," I said, "you wait for what you started to finish." She closed her eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in realization. And for the first time in a long time, she did not argue. Days passed differently after that. Not dramatically. Not in ways people notice from the outside. But inside a home, you can feel when a relationship stops moving forward and starts settling into truth. Victoria stopped making calls, not because she agreed, but because every call she made now was redirected, documented, or unanswered in ways that made her frustration loop back into silence. I watched her one evening standing in the hallway holding a letter she had already read 3 times. "They are treating me like I do not exist in this process," she said. I looked at her calmly. "They are treating the structure, not the emotion," I said. That distinction mattered more than she wanted to accept, because emotion had built this situation, but structure was now carrying it forward. One afternoon, I received a call from Robert again. "The review is progressing," he said. "There are no signs of reversal." I asked him one question. "And her?" There was a pause before he answered. "She is no longer considered a decision-maker in this matter." That sentence did not feel like victory. It felt like distance. I remember sitting alone later that night, thinking not about what was lost or gained, but about how quickly certainty can collapse when it is not built on understanding. Victoria eventually left the house for a few days. No dramatic exit, no final confrontation, just absence. When she returned briefly to collect personal things, she stood in the doorway and said something I did not expect. "I thought I was protecting us," she said. I nodded slowly. "I know," I replied. And that was the first time she looked at me without trying to win anything. Not anger, not defense. Just recognition that we had been living in 2 different interpretations of the same life for a long time. After she left again, I did not chase resolution. I did not chase explanation. I walked instead into the quiet parts of my own life that I had neglected for too long. I visited my parents' resting place in Charlottesville alone. The air there was still, the kind of still that does not ask questions. I stood there for a long time and said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because for the first time, I did not need words to justify anything anymore. I understood then something simple but permanent. Not everything that breaks is destroyed. Some things are just revealed. Weeks later, I found myself sitting at a small wooden table in a quiet cafe outside Richmond, watching ordinary people live ordinary lives, and I realized how far I had drifted from simplicity without noticing. Victoria's presence in my life had always been noise around structure. I never questioned enough. Now there was silence. And in that silence, I finally heard my own thoughts again. If there is anything I would want you to understand from this, it is not about systems or money or outcomes. It is about the moments where you stop explaining your value to people who were never listening for it. It is about the quiet decision to step back when something no longer recognizes who you are. Because sometimes peace does not arrive as victory. Sometimes it arrives as distance from everything that kept you in constant reaction. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt like you are constantly proving your worth inside a place that already decided not to see it, I want you to know something simple. You are allowed to stop performing. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to choose clarity over chaos. And you are allowed to protect your own sense of self without needing permission from anyone who benefits from your confusion. To everyone who stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Not just for listening, but for understanding that these stories are not really about houses or money or legal systems. They're about identity. They're about boundaries. They are about the quiet moment when a person decides they will no longer be defined by someone else's misunderstanding of them. If this story meant something to you, you can support the channel with a like. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I appreciate every single one. Remember this simple truth as you move forward. Self-respect is not taken from others, it is chosen by you. And once you choose it, everything else begins to realign in ways you do not need to force. There are more stories waiting for you here, stories about silence, truth, and the moments people finally see themselves clearly after years of being misunderstood. I hope you will stay for those too, because sometimes the next story is the one that helps you understand your own. Thank you for listening to this story.